She called the cops on a black veteran, then froze when the officer walked in. The bell above the door gave a sharp jingle as Harold pushed it open. He stepped inside, the scent of fried bacon and fresh coffee filling the air. The place was a classic checkered floors, worn-out booths, a counter lined with faded bar stools. It had probably been around for decades, the kind of spot where regulars had their names engraved into the rhythm of the morning rush. Harold adjusted his army cap, the embroidered golden eagle glinting slightly under the fluorescent lights. His knees ached from the long walk from the VA hospital, but he was used to the pain. At 76, he carried a history that most wouldn't understand. Just by looking at him, he spotted an empty table by the window and made his way over, setting his cane against the side of the booth. Outside, the sun hung low, catching the edges of parked cars and the peeling paint on the old gas station across the street from behind the counter, a young waitress. Melanie watched him. Her grip on the coffee pot tightened as she took him in his dark skin, his military hat, the slow, steady way he moved. She barely masked the flicker of disapproval in her eyes before walking over. "Can I help you?" Her tone was clipped, impatient. Harold gave her a polite nod. "I'll take a coffee black and the breakfast special if you've got it." She didn't write anything down. Instead, she crossed her arms, shifting her weight onto one leg. "We're full." Harold blinked, glancing around. A couple at the far end was finishing their meal. 2 booths sat completely empty. The counter had a few open spots. "Doesn't seem too full to me," he said evenly. She exhaled sharply through her nose. "We're not serving right now." His fingers drummed lightly against the table. He'd seen this before years ago, in places where he wasn't welcome back then. Signs had spelled it out. Now it was hidden behind fake smiles and flimsy excuses. He met her gaze steady. "I served this country. I earned the right to sit here and have a meal." Her expression hardened. "I don't make the rules." The diner had quieted, a few heads, turned conversations, pausing just long enough to pick up the tension in the air. An older man near the counter furrowed his brow but said nothing. Harold had spent his life choosing his battles, but he was too old to let people like this push him aside. He leaned back slightly. "I'll wait," but Melanie's patience had run out. She turned on her heel, marching toward the phone near the register. She picked it up and, without hesitation, dialed, "Yeah, I need an officer at Miller's Diner," she said, voice sharp. "There's a man here causing a disturbance. He won't leave." Harold didn't move. He just watched her, the weight of history pressing against him once again, but something told him this time would be different. Harold let out a slow breath, his fingers wrapping around the handle of his coffee cup, empty, still untouched. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen this kind of thing before. Wrapped in different words, hidden behind fake rules. It had been decades since the first time someone told him he didn't belong, but the sting never fully faded from the counter. Melanie kept her back, turned the phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, he's still here," she said. Voice low, but firm. "He's making me uncomfortable. He's refusing to leave." Harold glanced down at his hands, weathered with time and work. They had once held rifles in the scorching heat of the desert. They had patched up bleeding soldiers in the dead of night. They had built a life after war, even when the country he fought for didn't always fight for him. And now those same hands were being labeled as a threat. Without a single move on his part, he shifted slightly in his seat, catching the eye of a woman sitting at the far end of the diner. She looked away quickly, focusing on her half-eaten plate of scrambled eggs across the room. A man in a trucker's cap nudged his buddy, whispering something. Others simply kept eating, unwilling to get involved. Melanie hung up and turned back, her eyes flicking to Harold like he was already a problem solved. "They're on their way," she said, smirking slightly. "You should probably just go before they get here." Harold didn't move. "I fought for this country," he said, voice calm but steady. "The same one you live in." She scoffed. "That doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want." The words sat heavy in the air. He had heard them before on battlefields, in government offices, in quiet conversations where people thought he wasn't listening. The diner had gone silent now. Even the sizzling of the griddle behind the counter seemed distant. A deep voice broke the stillness. "You sure about that, miss?" It came from the older man at the counter, the one who had been quietly sipping his coffee. While all of this unfolded, he set his mug down and turned slightly in his stool. His face was lined with years, his eyes sharp with something Melanie clearly hadn't expected. Disapproval. Melanie's jaw tensed. "It's none of your business." The man raised an eyebrow. "Seems like you made it everyone's business when you called the cops on a man just trying to eat his breakfast." A flicker of hesitation crossed her face, but it was gone just as quickly. She crossed her arms. "If you don't like it, you can leave too." The older man let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Honey, I've been coming here since before you were born. Pretty sure I've got more right to be here than you for the first time." Melanie looked unsure, but before she could say anything, the sharp wail of sirens cut through the air. The sound sent a ripple through the diner forks clinking against plates, whispers picking up speed. Harold didn't turn to look. He just sat there waiting as the red and blue lights flashed through the front window. But the moment the officers stepped inside, everything changed. The diner door swung open with force, the little bell above it rattling. Two officers stepped inside their boots, heavy against the checkered floor. Their hands hovered near their belts, scanning the room for what they'd been told was a disturbance. Harold remained seated, his posture unchanged. He'd been in situations far more dangerous than this. He knew better than to move too fast to make any sudden gestures. Melanie straightened her voice, taking on a rehearsed innocence. "Officers, that's him." She pointed her polished nails, stabbing the air in Harold's direction. "He refused to leave when I asked him. He's making people uncomfortable." One of the officers, a tall man with a squared jaw, started forward, his stance rigid. His partner, slightly younger, followed a step behind, but as they got closer, something shifted. The older officer's face changed. His jaw loosened, his eyes widened, his brows creasing as if he was seeing a ghost. He stopped, mid-step. "Sergeant Daniels," his voice carried through the diner. Quiet, but waited. Harold finally looked up, his deep-set eyes meeting the officer's face. There was a long pause, one of those moments that stretched, making time feel slow and thick. Then recognition flickered in Harold's expression. "Officer Caldwell." Harold said, his voice steady. "Didn't expect to see you here." Melanie's confidence cracked. Her mouth opened slightly, confusion washing over her face. "Wait, you know him." Caldwell ignored her. His hands were off his belt now, his posture relaxed. He turned to his partner, shaking his head slightly. "Stand down." The younger officer, clearly unsure, hesitated before stepping back. Caldwell let out a breath. "Sergeant Daniel saved my life in Fallujah, pulled me out after my Humvee got hit by an IED. His voice had lost all the authority it carried when he first walked in. Now it was personal. The diner had gone dead, silent. Melanie took a step back. That can't be right," she stammered. He was being aggressive." Caldwell's eyes snapped to her cold and sharp. "That man aggressive." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You sure about that, miss?" She shrank slightly, glancing around as if looking for someone to back her up, but the room had turned against her. The older man at the counter leaned back, arms crossed. "Yeah, honey, I think you just got caught in a damn lie." A flush crept up Melanie's neck. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Caldwell turned back to Harold. "Sir, He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. This happened." Harold gave him a long look. "Not your fault," he said simply. But the damage was already done, and everyone knew it. Melanie's breathing had changed, shallow, quick, like she was struggling to process what just happened. The entire diner was still, every set of eyes locked onto her. The accusations she'd thrown so easily now hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Caldwell took a step closer to Harold, his voice quieter now. "Sir, I should have come by to see you sooner. Didn't know you were back in town." Harold gave a slow nod, his gaze still calm. Steady didn't expect a welcome party. A few people chuckled under their breath. The older man at the counter smirked. Even Coldwell let out a short breath that could have been a laugh if the weight of the moment wasn't pressing down on all of them, but Melanie wasn't laughing. Her face had gone pale, her fingers twisting around the edge of her apron. "I didn't know," she said, almost whispering. Harold finally turned his attention to her. Didn't know what his voice wasn't angry. It was something worse, measured patient, like he was waiting to hear if she'd be honest, if she'd own what she did. She hesitated. "You didn't know who I was?" Harold asked. The older man at the counter leaned back, arms crossed. "Yeah, honey, I think you just got caught in a damn lie." A flush crept up Melanie's neck. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Caldwell turned back to Harold. "Sir, He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. This happened." Harold gave him a long look. "Not your fault," he said simply. But the damage was already done, and everyone knew it. Melanie's breathing had changed, shallow, quick, like she was struggling to process what just happened. The entire diner was still, every set of eyes locked onto her. The accusations she'd thrown so easily now hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Coldwell took a step closer to Harold, his voice quieter now. "Sir, I should have come by to see you sooner, didn't know you were back in town." Harold gave a slow nod, his gaze still calm. Steady didn't expect a welcome party. A few people chuckled under their breath. The older man at the counter smirked. Even Coldwell let out a short breath that could have been a laugh if the weight of the moment wasn't pressing down on all of them, but Melanie wasn't laughing. Her face had gone pale, her fingers twisting around the edge of her apron. "I didn't know," she said, almost whispering. Harold finally turned his attention to her. Didn't know what his voice wasn't angry. It was something worse, measured patient, like he was waiting to hear if she'd be honest, if she'd own what she did. She hesitated. "You didn't know who I was?" Harold asked. Melanie swallowed. Or, "You didn't care." Silence. Caldwell let out a slow sigh and turned to the manager, a stocky man with a white apron tied tight around his waist. The manager had been watching everything, his face unreadable. "This how you run things here?" Caldwell asked. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to make the manager shift uncomfortably. The manager glanced at Melanie. Her eyes were wide, almost pleading. But there was no saving this. The manager shook his head. "Melanie, take off your apron." Her mouth fell open. "Wait, what, you heard me?" His voice was firm. "Now. We don't do this here." She let out a nervous laugh, but no one joined her. I was just doing what I thought was right." The older man at the counter scoffed. "Nah, girl, you were doing what you thought you could get away with." Her chest rose and fell too fast. Her hands clenched into fists. "This isn't fair," she snapped. "I didn't mean anything by it." Harold tilted his head slightly. "You called the cops on me," he said, voice even for sitting down. Melanie's lip quivered, but she said nothing. The manager exhaled through his nose and pointed toward the back door. "You're done here. Get your things and go for a second." She looked like she might argue, but then her shoulders slumped. She pulled off her apron, tossed it on the counter, and walked out without another word. The door shut behind her, and just like that, she was gone. But her absence didn't erase what had just happened, if anything. It made it clearer. The hush that had settled over the diner didn't lift. Right away, it sat heavy, thick, like everyone was still trying to process what they had just witnessed. Then, a chair scraped against the floor. The older man at the counter leaned forward, shaking his head. "Damn shame," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "A man serves his country, comes home, and this is the thanks he gets." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The woman in the corner, the one who had looked away earlier, finally spoke. I should have said something sooner." She admitted, her voice uneasy. "I saw what she was doing, and She trailed off, guilt flickering in her eyes. Harold looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You saw it." It wasn't a question she swallowed. "Yeah." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a slow nod, he simply replied, "Now, you know." Coldwell exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I hate that this even happened," he muttered. Then turning to Harold, he asked, "You okay?" Sir Harold gave him a look, one that said he'd been through far worse. "Yeah," he said, "but this ain't about me." The weight of those words settled over the room, because it wasn't just about Harold. It was about how easy it had been for Melanie to call the cops, how natural it had felt for some people to look away, how long it had taken for someone to speak up, the manager who had been silent since firing. Melanie cleared his throat. "Sir, I'd like to cover your meal," he said on the house, "and I want to personally apologize." Harold studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "I didn't come here for a free meal." The manager's face fell slightly. Harold reached for his cane and with slow, deliberate movements stood up. He pulled a 20 from his wallet and set it on the table. "Just make sure this don't happen again," he said. The manager nodded, his face tight with something close to shame. Harold turned, glancing at Caldwell. "Take care of yourself, son." Caldwell straightened, giving him a firm nod. "You too, sir." Then Harold walked toward the door, his pace steady. The diner was silent again, but not like before. This wasn't the weight of ignorance. This was the weight of realization, and Melanie wasn't the only one who had to live with it. The bell above the diner door jingled one last time as Harold stepped outside. The late morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows on the pavement. He paused for a moment, gripping his cane a little tighter before making his way toward the sidewalk behind him. The silence in the diner lingered. No one moved right away. The weight of what had just happened still sat heavy in the air. Caldwell exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I hate this," he muttered again, his voice thick with frustration. The older man at the counter leaned back. What part, the part where he got disrespected, or the part where he handled it better than any of us would have? Caldwell let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. Both the manager looked at the $20 bill still sitting on the table. Something about it made his chest ache. "I should have stepped in sooner," he admitted. The woman near the window shifted in her seat, shame flickering across her face. "We all should have outside." Harold walked slowly, his cane tapping against the sidewalk. A few people in the parking lot were still staring, some whispering among themselves, but Harold didn't acknowledge them. He had nothing to prove. A few feet away, Melanie sat on the curb, arms wrapped around her knees. Her eyes were red, her breath coming in uneven gasps. She wasn't crying. Not exactly, but the shock hadn't worn off yet. She looked up when Harold passed. Their eyes met for a second. She almost spoke, almost said something, an excuse, an apology, anything. But Harold didn't stop, didn't slow down. He simply gave her a long, quiet look, not angry, not smug, just knowing. Then he walked past her, stepping into the street, heading toward wherever he needed to go next, and Melanie was left there alone with nothing but the weight of her own choices. Because some lessons don't come with words, they come with silence. The world kept moving. The traffic light at the corner flicked from red to green. A car engine rumbled to life. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, but inside that diner, and in Melanie's mind, time wasn't moving quite so fast. She stayed on the curb long after Harold had disappeared down the sidewalk. Her hands fidgeted. Her chest felt tight, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was angry at the consequences or at herself. Inside, the customers had returned to their meals, but the energy wasn't the same. The older man at the counter sipped his coffee deep in thought. The woman near the window still looked unsettled. The manager sighed and cleared the $20 bill from the table, his fingers lingering on it before slipping it into the register. Caldwell, standing near the door, watched it all. Then, shaking his head, he muttered, "Damn shame," before walking out. Melanie finally pushed herself up from the curb, her legs unsteady. She had spent the morning thinking she was in control, thinking she could do what she did without consequence. But now, she wasn't so sure. And that was the thing about the truth. It didn't go away just because you didn't like it. Respect isn't just for the people we recognize. It's for the people we don't. It's for the ones who have walked through battles we'll never understand, the ones who have earned more than a seat at a table. But the dignity of being seen as human, Harold didn't ask for recognition. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't need to prove himself, because real strength doesn't need validation. It just exists. And the real lesson wasn't for Harold. It was for everyone else in that diner, maybe even for us. If this story made you think, made you feel something, share it. Stories like this aren't just about one man or one moment. They're about all of us, because silence isn't always the answer. Sometimes it's speaking up before the damage is done. Let's do better.